I built that cabin with my own 2 hands. Then one letter changed everything. Illegal construction, it said. Subject to immediate removal. I hadn't broken a single law. Weeks later, inspectors showed up, but not for me. They came for the HOA clubhouse next door. Turns out it was sitting on MY land. And the woman who reported me built it there herself. My name is Ryan Cole, 34. A structural engineer who spends weekdays in Denver and weekends 2 hours west in the hills above Cedar Hollow. My grandfather Walt left me 11 acres of pine and granite when he passed, along with a promise. Never let anyone push you off what's yours. I didn't know how soon I'd need that advice. The land had been in my family since before Cedar Ridge Estates existed, back when it was just scrub pasture and a dirt road. I built a modest, code-compliant cabin on it myself. Permits in hand, inspections passed. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend retreat. Instead, it became the center of a war I never asked for. Cedar Ridge Estates grew up around my grandfather's old parcel over the decades, subdivided and sold lot by lot until suburban fences pressed right against our tree line. The HOA ran the neighborhood with the usual rules: paint colors, mailbox styles, lawn heights. My cabin sat just outside their boundary, or so every deed I'd ever seen confirmed. I met Denise Marsh at the mailbox my second weekend there. She introduced herself as HOA president like it was a military rank, clipboard already in hand. She asked, sweetly, whether I'd filed my architectural review before building. I told her the cabin was outside HOA jurisdiction. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes did. "We'll see about that," she said, and walked off without another word. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every neighborhood has one person who treats bylaws like scripture. I figured as long as my paperwork was clean, Denise Marsh was someone else's problem, not mine. My neighbor Sam, who'd lived on the ridge for 15 years, warned me over a beer that night. She got the Alversons to sell their place after 2 years of code complaints, he said. Made their lives hell over a shed. She'll do the same to you if you let her. I laughed it off. County, a surveyed lot, and a grandfather's deed older than the HOA charter itself. What could a homeowners association possibly do to a property they had no legal authority over? I genuinely believed the paperwork would protect me. I was wrong about how far she'd go. 2 weeks passed in peace. I finished the porch railing, planted a garden bed, and started to feel like the cabin was finally mine in more than name. Then Denise started walking the property line with a tape measure of her own. No survey stakes, no permission, just her and a folding ruler and a notebook. I watched her from the porch one Saturday morning, jotting notes near my south fence line. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was documenting encroachment concerns for the board. I reminded her the fence had sat in that exact spot since 1987. She wrote something down anyway and left without responding. A week later, a certified letter arrived from Cedar Ridge Estates HOA, addressed to me personally, citing unauthorized structure encroaching on association common ground. I read it twice, then a third time. My cabin was nowhere near the clubhouse or any shared HOA land. The claim made no sense on paper. I called the county assessor's office the same afternoon. The clerk pulled my parcel number and confirmed what I already knew. My cabin sat entirely on private land, outside any HOA-controlled boundary, exactly as my grandfather's original deed described. I felt a flicker of relief. Surely a phone call would clear this up. I called Denise directly, deed number in hand, ready to end the confusion in one conversation. She didn't want to hear it. Numbers, she said flatly. I'd hire a lawyer if I were you. Then she hung up before I could ask which surveyor she meant. That night I dug through my grandfather's old filing cabinet, pulling every scrap of paper he'd kept. Original 1974 deed, a hand-drawn plat map, tax receipts going back decades. Everything matched the county's records. Nothing matched whatever different numbers Denise claimed to have. I started to wonder where her numbers came from at all. Sam stopped by the next morning, coffee in hand, looking grim. She's already telling people at the mailboxes that you built on stolen land, he said. Half the cul-de-sac thinks you're some outsider who snuck a cabin onto association property. Reputation, I realized, moved faster than facts ever could. I decided to stay calm and methodical. I scanned every document, printed 3 copies, and requested a formal meeting with the HOA board to present my case. The board secretary emailed back within the hour. Denise handles all boundary disputes personally. That answer told me everything about how Cedar Ridge Estates actually operated. I should have recognized the shape of what was coming. A woman with unchecked authority, a fabricated survey, and a neighborhood ready to believe her over a stranger with a deed. I still thought logic and paperwork would win. I had no idea Denise Marsh had run this exact play before. The real trouble started at the county building department, where I went to request a copy of whatever complaint had triggered my certified letter. The clerk slid a printed form across the counter, filed by Denise Marsh, HOA president, alleging my cabin lacked permits and sat on disputed land. Every word of it was false. We already have your permits on file, the clerk said, pulling up my application from 8 months earlier. Stamped approved. She looked almost apologetic. Someone filed a complaint anyway. We're required to send an inspector regardless. An inspection. Over a lie someone had typed up and mailed in cold blood. The inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend organizing every document I owned. Permits, inspection sign-offs, the surveyed plat, even photos of the foundation pour with the county inspector standing beside it. If Denise wanted a fight built on paperwork, I intended to win it with paperwork. Inspector Alvarez arrived exactly on time, polite and thorough, walking the cabin's perimeter with my documents in hand. Within 20 minutes he confirmed everything was in order, proper setbacks, valid permits, correct construction. He looked almost tired as he said it.
This is the 3rd complaint like this.
That single sentence stuck with me the rest of the day. Pattern. Acting to my cabin specifically. She was running a routine she'd used before, on other people, for reasons that had nothing to do with actual code violations. I wanted to know who else she'd targeted, and why. I mentioned it to Sam that evening, and his face changed. The Alversons weren't the only ones, he said slowly. There was an older widow, Etta Byrne, lived at the end of the Ridge Road maybe 6 years back. Denise ran her out over a supposed boundary dispute too. Nobody talks about it anymore, Etta Byrne. To me yet. But I wrote it down anyway, some instinct telling me it might matter later. For now, My priority was simpler. Get Denise to withdraw the false complaint before it escalated into fines. Lien. Or worse. I drafted a certified letter of my own. My letter laid out the facts plainly, county-approved permits, a surveyed and recorded property line, and a formal request that the HOA rescind its complaint in writing within 14 days. I copied the county building department on it. I wanted a paper trail this time, one that couldn't be quietly rewritten later. Denise's response came not by mail but by drone. I heard it before I saw it. A small quadcopter hovering over my roofline on a Sunday morning. Camera clearly pointed down. When I stepped outside and waved, it simply rose higher and drifted back toward the marsh property without acknowledgement. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line to report it, more out of principle than urgency. The deputy who answered sighed like he'd fielded this exact call before. Cedar Ridge, right? He asked. We've had drone complaints from that neighborhood before too. Another pattern. Another shrug. Another sign nothing here was new. A week after the drone incident, someone, I never found out who, spray-painted trespasser across my mailbox post in bright orange letters. It washed off with turpentine, but the message was clear enough. Whoever did it wanted me rattled, uncertain whether my neighbors or Denise herself were behind it. I installed a trail camera near the mailbox that same afternoon, more out of frustration than any real plan. If someone wanted to harass me anonymously, I intended to have proof the next time it happened. Sam helped me mount it discreetly in the tree lean, angled to catch the road and the post. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, I showed up uninvited with a folder of documents under my arm. Denise's expression flickered with something like annoyance when she saw me enter, quickly replaced by her practiced hostess smile as she gestured toward an open folding chair. I asked, calmly and publicly, why the association had filed a complaint the county itself found baseless. Denise answered smoothly that concerns were still being reviewed by our land committee. A committee, I later learned, that consisted of exactly one member, herself. No vote, no minutes, no oversight of any kind. A few neighbors exchanged glances I couldn't quite read, some sympathetic, some clearly uneasy about crossing Denise in public. One older man near the back murmured, "Here we go again," just loud enough for me to hear. Whatever pattern Sam had described, this room had clearly lived through it before. I left that meeting with more questions than answers. But one thing had crystallized. This wasn't really about my cabin, my permits, or any actual property line. This was about control, about a woman who'd built her authority on intimidation, and who wasn't going to relinquish it just because the facts disagreed with her. The following week, a lien notice arrived at my Denver address, filed against my cabin property for unpaid association assessment fees I had never once been billed for. My name wasn't even on any HOA membership roster, since my parcel had never legally belonged to Cedar Ridge Estates. The lien was fabricated from nothing. I drove straight to the county recorder's office and requested a copy of the filing. There it was, notarized and everything, listing my parcel number, a dollar amount, and Denise Marsh's signature as HOA president. Whoever notarized it either hadn't checked the parcel's actual ownership status, or hadn't cared to. The recorder's clerk, an older woman named Pat, frowned at the document longer than I expected. "This parcel number doesn't fall inside their platted boundary," she said, pulling up a digital map overlay. "I don't know how they got a notary to stamp this." I asked her to print that map for me. That overlay became my first real piece of hard evidence. An official county map clearly showing my grandfather's original parcel sitting outside the platted HOA boundary. Exactly as every deed had always said. Whatever survey Denise claimed to have used, it didn't match anything the county itself had on record. I hired a real estate attorney that same afternoon, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Nair who specialized in property disputes. She read through my folder in under 10 minutes and looked up with something between amusement and disbelief. "This lien is going to be easy to get thrown out," she said. "But," she added, "someone forged or manipulated a survey to make this claim in the first place. That's the part worth digging into." She recommended I request the actual survey document Denise had referenced back when this started. The one supposedly showing different numbers than the county's own records. I submitted a formal records request to the HOA board demanding the surveyor's name, license number, and a copy of the disputed survey. Denise stalled for 11 days before finally producing a document, and signed, "Unlicensed," printed on plain paper with no seal, no registration number, nothing an actual licensed surveyor would ever submit. Priya laughed out loud reading it. "This isn't a survey," she said. "This is a sketch someone made in an afternoon." She flagged the document for the state's Board of Licensing anyway, just in case whoever produced it held any professional credentials worth revoking. The name at the bottom read simply, T. Marsh.
As Denise. I asked Sam if he knew of any relatives living nearby, and he thought for a moment before nodding slowly. "Her nephew does some kind of land work, I think. Todd something. We'll go on it. Parks it at her place sometimes."
A nephew with no visible surveying license had apparently produced the entire document Denise used to justify a fabricated lien against my property. It wasn't proof of anything criminal yet, just a thread, but it was the first thread that actually connected Denise's claims to something other than honest confusion. Priya filed a motion to dismiss the lien, citing the county's own boundary map as controlling evidence. A hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which felt like an eternity given how fast Denise had already escalated things. I spent that waiting period bracing for whatever she might try next. I didn't have to wait long. I found my driveway gate chained shut with a padlock that wasn't mine. A laminated notice zip-tied to the chain reading, "Access restricted pending boundary review, Cedar Ridge HOA." My own driveway, blocked by an association with no jurisdiction over my land at all. I called Priya immediately, practically shaking with anger, and she told me flatly not to cut the chain myself. "Document it, call the sheriff, and let this become their problem legally," she said. I photographed everything, the chain, the notice, the tire tracks leading straight from the Marsh driveway. The deputy who responded recognized the situation instantly. "This is private property access obstruction," he said, cutting the chain himself with bolt cutters from his trunk. "I'll write this up." For the first time, someone in an official capacity was treating Denise's actions as what they actually were. Denise, when confronted by the deputy on her own porch, claimed she'd merely been protecting disputed common ground, pending the board's review. The deputy reminded her, evenly, That a chain on someone else's driveway wasn't a board policy. It was criminal mischief, and it would appear in his incident report. That report became another piece of Priya's growing file. Alongside the fabricated lien, the unlicensed sketch masquerading as a survey, and the county's own map contradicting all of it. Denise was building her case entirely out of intimidation and paperwork nobody had ever bothered to verify. It was starting to unravel. Still, the community seemed slow to notice. At the grocery store in town, a woman I vaguely recognized from the cul-de-sac eyed me like I'd done something wrong, whispering to her friend as I passed. Denise's version of events had clearly spread further and faster than the deputy's incident report ever would. Sam tried to reassure me over dinner that week. People here have short memories once the truth comes out, he said. They believed the same story about the Alversons until the county fined the HOA for retaliatory code complaints. Then everyone suddenly remembered how Denise really operates. I hoped he was right. I asked him, almost offhand, whatever happened to Etta Byrne after she left? Sam shrugged. I think. Lives with her daughter now. Never talks about it. Backed right up against the Clubhouse property. Kind of like yours does now. That detail lodged itself in my mind and wouldn't let go. My cabin sat near the HOA's shared common ground too. Close enough that a careless observer might genuinely confuse the boundary, or close enough that someone motivated to blur it could make a convincing case to anyone who didn't check the deed. I pulled my grandfather's original 1974 deed again that night, reading the meets and bounds description line by line against the county's digital overlay. Everything matched perfectly, down to the boulder marker mentioned in the old language. Whatever Denise's different numbers claimed, they contradicted 80 years of consistent, recorded fact. I mentioned this discovery to Priya, and she went quiet for a moment before asking a question that changed the direction of everything. Has anyone ever actually surveyed the HOA's own common ground boundary? She asked. Or is everyone just assuming the clubhouse sits where the original plat said it would? I didn't know the answer, and neither did the county recorder when I called to ask. The original 1980s plat had been amended twice over the decades, each time by the HOA's own hired surveyor, never independently verified against my grandfather's older, still valid deed. Nobody had ever cross-checked the two. Priya requested certified copies of both HOA plat amendments from the county archive. It took another 2 weeks to process. Time Denise spent escalating in smaller, meaner ways, reporting my parked truck for blocking a fire lane that didn't exist, and complaining that my porch light violated a dark sky ordinance nobody enforced. Each complaint got dismissed by the county almost as fast as it arrived, but each one cost me time, stress, and a small fee to respond formally. I started to understand this wasn't really about winning any single dispute. It was attrition, designed to exhaust me into simply walking away from my own land. I refused to give her that satisfaction. Every dismissed complaint went straight into Priya's file, building a documented pattern of harassment that would matter enormously later, even if it felt pointless in the moment. Sam kept reminding me, she's done this before. She always overplays her hand eventually. The plat amendments finally arrived, and Priya spread them across her office table beside my grandfather's original deed. She traced one boundary line with her finger, frowning, then pulled out a ruler. This amendment, she said slowly, Shifted the clubhouse boundary about 40 feet without your grandfather's signature anywhere on it. 40 feet. Onto what had always, on every earlier document, been recorded as my grandfather's land. The HOA hadn't just misjudged my cabin's location. Their own clubhouse expansion, built years ago, appeared to sit partly on property that legally belonged to my family the entire time. Priya cautioned me not to get ahead of the evidence. We need an independent, licensed survey before we say anything publicly, she said. If I'm right, this flips the entire dispute upside down. But if we're wrong, we lose all credibility right when we need it most. I agreed completely. We hired an independent licensed surveyor from 2 counties over. Someone with no connection whatsoever to Cedar Hollow or the Marsh family. His name was Grant Okafor, and he scheduled the survey for the following week, promising results within 10 business days of fieldwork completion. The waiting felt unbearable. In the meantime, Denise seemed to sense something shifting, though she couldn't have known exactly what. She started showing up near my property line more often, sometimes just standing at the edge of her yard staring toward the cabin, saying nothing, her presence somehow more unsettling than any letter had been. One evening she finally spoke, calling across the fence line as I stacked firewood. "You should sell before this gets ugly," she said, almost gently, like she was doing me a favor. "Nobody wins fighting the association. Ask around." I said nothing back, just kept stacking logs until she walked away. Grant Okafor's crew arrived that Thursday, running equipment across both properties with the HOA's grudging, legally required permission to access shared boundary points. Denise watched from her porch the entire time, arms crossed, occasionally photographing the surveyors with her phone as though documenting evidence of some crime. The survey took 3 full days. Grant explained the process patiently each evening over coffee. GPS coordinates cross-referenced against county monuments. Historical deed language matched to physical boulder and tree markers still standing after decades. Science and documentation. Finally, instead of a nephew's and signed sketch on plain paper. While we waited on results, Priya dug deeper into Todd Marsh's background, discovering he held no surveying license in any state, active or lapsed. He worked, according to public records, as a landscaping contractor. The survey he'd produced for Denise wasn't just sloppy. It was, quite simply, entirely fabricated. That discovery alone gave Priya grounds to request sanctions against the HOA for filing false documents with the county. But she urged patience. "Let's wait for Grant's report," she said. "If I'm right about that clubhouse boundary, we won't need to ask for sanctions. The county will hand them out itself." 10 days later, Grant's report landed in my inbox, dense with technical language but unmistakable in its conclusion. My grandfather's original parcel boundary, verified against county monuments and historical deed descriptions, extended roughly 42 feet past where the HOA's amended plat placed it, directly underneath the clubhouse's rear deck. I read that sentence 4 times before it fully registered. The clubhouse deck, the one Denise had stood on countless times hosting board meetings and neighborhood barbecues, sat partly on land that had belonged to my family since before Cedar Ridge Estates existed. The accuser, turned out, was the true encroacher. Priya couldn't hide her satisfaction reading the report. "This changes everything," she said. "The lien, the fake survey, the driveway chain. All of it was Denise trying to muddy a boundary dispute before anyone discovered her own association was sitting on land it never legally owned. Finally, clarity. I asked her what came next. She smiled. The first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her in weeks. Now we let the county do what counties do best, she said. We file this report with the assessor and the building department, and we let the professionals take it from here. For a few days, an unfamiliar quiet settled over the ridge. No drones overhead, no chained gates, no fresh letters in the mailbox. Priya had filed Grant's survey with the county, and we were waiting on an official response before making any public move. I almost let myself relax. Sam noticed the calm too, remarking one evening that Denise had skipped her usual porch-watching routine for nearly a week straight. Feels like the eye of the storm, he said, only half joking. I told him I hoped it just meant she'd finally realized she'd overreached. Neither of us really believed that. I used the quiet to finish small projects around the cabin I'd neglected during the chaos. Repainting the shutters, clearing deadfall from the tree line, reinforcing the garden fence against deer. Ordinary work felt strange after weeks of legal maneuvering, like remembering what living there was actually supposed to feel like. I even ran into Denise's husband's old friend, a retired board member named Frank, at the hardware store in town. He recognized my name and studied me for a long moment before speaking. You're the cabin fella, he said. Word of advice, Denise doesn't lose gracefully. Watch your back. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and said some things were better left in the past. It was the second time someone had hinted at history I couldn't quite access yet. First Etta Byrne, now whatever Frank clearly knew and didn't want to say aloud. Priya, when I mentioned Frank's comment, suggested we track down Etta Byrne directly. If there's a pattern here going back years, a witness with first-hand experience could matter enormously, she said.
Especially if the county ends up needing evidence of intent.
Finding Etta wasn't hard. Sam's wife knew her daughter from church, and within 2 days I had a phone number and a cautious invitation to visit. I drove into town that Saturday, nervous in a way I couldn't quite explain, to meet a woman I'd never known existed a month earlier. Etta was in her 70s, sharp-eyed, and clearly still angry about something 6 years old. When I mentioned Denise Marsh's name, her expression hardened instantly. That woman took my home, she said, without preamble. Told the whole neighborhood I'd built my shed on their land. It was a lie. She described almost exactly what had happened to me. A false complaint, a fabricated lien, community pressure, until she'd finally given up and sold at a loss just to escape the harassment. I never got a proper survey done, she admitted. I didn't know I even could. I just wanted peace. I told her about Grant's findings, about the clubhouse deck sitting on my family's land, about Todd Marsh's fake survey credentials. Etta went very quiet, then asked a single question that hit me like a physical blow. Did anyone ever check where my old lot actually ended? Nobody had. Since been resold to a new family. The boundary dispute buried under years of forgotten paperwork. But if the HOA's amended plat had already been wrong once, decades ago, when it shifted the clubhouse boundary, there was a real chance her old lot had been affected too. Priya agreed to request the historical amendment records covering Etta's former parcel as well. warning it might take time given how old the filings were. Etta gripped my hand before I left, eyes wet. "Nobody ever believed me before," she said. "Please don't let her get away with it this time." I promised her I wouldn't, though I had no idea yet exactly how this would end. Driving home, I felt something shift inside me. This had stopped being purely about protecting my own cabin. It had become about a pattern of harm Denise Marsh had apparently gotten away with for years. That quiet week ended abruptly the following Monday, when I received notice that the county building department had scheduled a formal review hearing regarding both my boundary dispute and, unexpectedly, the HOA's own plat amendment history. Denise, I later learned, had been notified of the same hearing that same morning. The hearing notice lit a fuse under Denise that the quiet weeks apparently hadn't extinguished at all. Within days, she called an emergency HOA board meeting, and Sam texted me a photo of the flyer posted at the mailbox kiosk. "Urgent. Boundary dispute threatens community assets. All residents encouraged to attend." I wasn't invited, obviously, but Sam went and reported back afterward, shaking his head. "She stood up there and said you were trying to seize the clubhouse land through some technicality," he said. "Made it sound like you were the one scheming." People were nodding along like it made sense. It was a clever inversion, I had to admit, reframing the survey that proved her own encroachment as some predatory legal maneuver on my part. Denise understood something I was only beginning to grasp. In a room full of frightened homeowners, the loudest, most confident voice usually wins the narrative first. A petition began circulating shortly after that meeting, demanding the HOA protect community assets by any legal means necessary against my supposed land grab. Sam refused to sign it, and told me at least a dozen neighbors quietly declined too, uneasy with how aggressively Denise was framing things. But many signed anyway. I found myself, for the first time, genuinely worried about more than just paperwork. If public opinion turned hard enough against me, it could complicate everything from the hearing's optics to simple day-to-day life on the ridge. I mentioned this to Priya, who told me not to fight the narrative directly. "Let the evidence do that," she said. "Every time you argue in public, it looks like a fight between neighbors. Every time the county produces a document, it looks like fact. Save your energy for the hearing room, not the mailbox kiosk." It was hard advice to follow, but I trusted her. Denise, apparently unsatisfied with a petition alone, escalated further by contacting my employer directly, a structural engineering firm in Denver, filing what she described as a professional ethics complaint, alleging I'd falsified survey documents to steal HOA property. My supervisor called me into his office the following morning. Baffled, I explained the entire situation as calmly as I could, showing him Grant's licensed survey report and Priya's file of dismissed complaints. He listened quietly, then said something that stuck with me. "This woman filed a formal complaint against you with zero evidence. That tells me everything I need to know. Still, the complaint had to be formally investigated per company policy, costing me 2 additional weeks of anxiety and an uncomfortable meeting with HR. It was ultimately dismissed entirely, but the experience made something crystal clear. Denise wasn't just fighting a property dispute anymore. She was trying to dismantle my life piece by piece. Priya added the employer complaint to her growing file without much comment, though her jaw tightened reading it. This is starting to look less like overzealous HOA enforcement she said. And more like a targeted harassment campaign. That distinction matters a great deal once we're standing in front of a judge. Around this same time, someone posted my cabin's address, along with photos apparently taken from a public road, on a local community Facebook group, accusing me of illegally seizing shared HOA land through a corrupt surveyor. The comments filled quickly with strangers I'd never met, confidently condemning me. Sam screenshot the entire thread before it mysteriously got deleted a day later, likely once someone realized how legally exposed the poster had become. The account behind it used a name I didn't recognize, but its profile photo, oddly, matched a landscaping truck logo Sam said belonged to Todd Marsh. Priya filed that screenshot too, building what she called a pattern of coordinated harassment, spanning fabricated documents, false professional complaints, and now online defamation. Judges notice patterns, she reminded me during one particularly exhausting week. One bad complaint looks like a mistake. 5 looks like a campaign. I started sleeping poorly, replaying every escalation in my head, wondering what Denise might try next. Sam, sensing my exhaustion, invited me over for dinner one night just to get me off the ridge for a few hours. His wife made a point of not mentioning the HOA once during the meal. It helped, more than I expected. I came home that night feeling steadier, ready to keep fighting through legitimate channels instead of getting pulled into Denise's chaos. The hearing was still 3 weeks out, and Priya kept reminding me that patience, not panic, would ultimately decide how this all resolved. That patience got tested again when I discovered, quite by accident, that Todd Marsh's landscaping truck had been parked at my property's shared access easement for 2 consecutive mornings, ostensibly doing brush clearing work the HOA had never mentioned to me, on land whose boundary was actively under legal dispute. I confronted him directly the second morning, and his answer was evasive at best. Denise said this was association land, he mumbled, clearly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact entirely. When I mentioned Grant's survey findings, something flickered across his face. Not confusion, but recognition. He knew. I asked him outright whether he actually held any surveying license, watching his expression carefully. He hesitated just a beat too long before saying, "I do land work, not official surveys." A careful non-answer that told me everything Priya's public records search had already confirmed. He left without finishing the job. That confrontation, small as it was, gave me something I hadn't expected, a flicker of genuine doubt in someone close to Denise's operation. I mentioned it to Priya, who suggested gently that if Todd ever felt cornered enough, he might eventually become a useful witness rather than a loyal accomplice. For now, though, Denise showed no sign of doubting herself at all. A new letter arrived that week, this one threatening a formal HOA lawsuit against me for trespass and interference with association operations, despite the fact that no court had ever ruled the disputed boundary belonged to the HOA in the first place. Priya read the letter and actually laughed. A short, sharp sound of disbelief. "She's suing you preemptively over land grant survey says is legally yours," she said. "This is either supreme confidence or supreme desperation. Given everything else we've found, I'm betting heavily on desperation." I hoped she was right. The lawsuit threat rattled me anyway, despite Priya's confidence. mostly because of how much money and time even a frivolous legal fight could cost. She reassured me the county hearing would likely resolve the underlying boundary question first, which would gut any lawsuit's foundation before it even reached a courtroom. I clung to that reassurance through another difficult week, during which Denise apparently convinced the HOA board to approve emergency landscaping modifications along the disputed boundary, modifications that turned out to be a hastily built wooden fence, erected overnight, cutting directly across what Grant's survey identified as my property. I woke to hammering at 6 in the morning and found 3 men, presumably hired contractors, driving fence posts along a line roughly 10 feet inside my actual boundary. When I demanded they stop, one shrugged apologetically. Just doing what we're paid to do. Man. Talk to the HOA about it. I called Priya immediately, and she instructed me to document everything before taking any action myself. Photos, timestamps, video of the crew working. This is likely trespass and property damage, she said. Let the sheriff handle stopping the work. Don't give Denise any excuse to claim you assaulted her contractors. The responding deputy, a different one this time, seemed genuinely baffled by the situation once I explained it, boundary survey in hand. He ordered the crew to halt immediately pending clarification of legal ownership. Much to their visible relief, they clearly hadn't wanted to be caught in the middle of this either. Denise arrived 20 minutes later, apparently alerted by one of the contractors, and launched into an argument with the deputy about association authority over historically shared common ground. The deputy, unmoved, told her plainly that a private survey dispute needed to go through the county, not a fence crew at dawn. I stood back and watched her argue, really studying her for the first time since this began. There was something almost performative in her outrage, a practiced quality to the indignation, like she'd rehearsed variations of this exact scene many times before, on many different neighbors, and simply expected it to work again. It didn't work. Not this time. The deputy's incident report cited unauthorized construction on disputed property, adding yet another documented incident to Priya's steadily thickening file. Denise left without another word to me, though her expression, just before she turned away, carried something I hadn't seen from her before, real uncertainty. That uncertainty apparently didn't slow her down for long. Within days, I learned through Sam that Denise had begun quietly reaching out to individual board members, urging them to vote on emergency legal action against me without a full board meeting or proper notice, hoping to push something through before the hearing. One board member, a soft-spoken retiree named Harold, actually called me directly, uneasy about what he described as irregular procedure. He said Denise had been pressuring members individually for weeks, bypassing normal HOA bylaws entirely whenever it suited her, something he'd apparently noticed and quietly worried about for years. I asked Harold, carefully, whether he'd be willing to speak with Priya about how the HOA board actually operated under Denise's leadership. He hesitated a long moment before agreeing, admitting he'd wanted an excuse to speak up for a long time but had always been too intimidated to do it alone. Priya's conversation with Harold 2 days later yielded more than either of us expected. Denise, turned out, had unilaterally approved the earlier plat amendment shifting the clubhouse boundary years ago, without a full board vote, using her position as president to simply declare its settled association policy on her own authority. That single admission connected every thread we'd gathered: the fabricated lien, the fake survey, the overnight fence. All of it consistent with someone accustomed to making unilateral decisions and expecting nobody to ever challenge them successfully. Denise hadn't just made a mistake once. She'd built an entire system around never being questioned. Harold agreed to provide a signed statement for the hearing, describing the board's actual governance practices under Denise's leadership. Priya called it a gift we didn't expect, noting that internal testimony from a board member carried far more weight than any survey or deed alone ever could in front of a judge. I felt something shift in the balance of this fight for the first time since it began. We weren't just defending my cabin's legality anymore, or even proving the clubhouse encroached on my land. We were assembling a genuine case that Denise Marsh had abused her position for years, against multiple homeowners. Emboldened, Priya reached back out to Etta Byrne, asking if she'd be willing to provide a statement too, describing her own experience 6 years earlier. Etta agreed without hesitation this time, telling Priya over the phone that she'd waited years for someone to finally take her seriously about this. With Harold's internal testimony and Etta's historical account both in hand, alongside Grant's survey and the county's own inconsistent plat records, Priya said our case had grown from a single boundary dispute into something the county building department would find very difficult to dismiss or minimize at the upcoming hearing. Denise, apparently sensing the tide turning against her, shifted tactics again, this time reaching out to me directly with an unexpected phone call. Her voice was different, softer, almost conciliatory. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot," she said. "What if we settled this quietly, between us, before the hearing?" I asked Priya about it before responding, and she was blunt. "She's not offering to make things right," Priya said. "She's offering to make the evidence disappear before it becomes public record. Don't take any deal that doesn't involve full transparency with the county." I called Denise back and declined. Her tone shifted instantly back to something colder. "You'll regret not working with me," she said, before hanging up without waiting for a response. It felt less like a threat about the hearing specifically, and more like a general promise that whatever came next wouldn't be pleasant, regardless of the outcome. 2 days later, my truck's tires were slashed overnight in my own driveway, all 4 of them, with no witnesses and no camera footage since my trail cam near the mailbox didn't cover that far up the drive. I filed a police report anyway, though I suspected little would come of it. Priya added it to the file with a note of caution. "We can't directly connect this to Denise without evidence," she reminded me. "But the timing speaks for itself in context." I moved my trail camera closer to the cabin itself that same week, unwilling to leave any more blind spots exposed. The hearing date crept closer, now just 10 days away, and the pressure from every direction seemed to intensify simultaneously. More whispers in town, another anonymous online post, a second lien attempt that Priya got dismissed within hours this time. The county clerk clearly growing weary of processing Denise's filings. I found myself, despite everything, growing strangely calm as the hearing approached. Somewhere in the chaos, I'd stopped feeling like a victim scrambling to defend himself and started feeling like someone finally holding real evidence against a person who'd operated without consequence for far too long. The tide had turned. Sam noticed the shift too, telling me one evening that I seemed different than the anxious guy who'd shown up at his door with a fabricated lien notice months earlier. "You've got receipts now," he said, laughing. "She picked the wrong cabin owner this time." I hoped he was right. Priya finalized our hearing presentation that week, grants license survey. The county's own inconsistent plat amendments. Harold's sign statement on board governance. Etta's historical account. And the sheriff's incident reports documenting the chained gate, the overnight fence, and the harassment campaign spanning months. It was, by any measure, thorough. She warned me the hearing wouldn't necessarily resolve everything in one sitting. County building departments move carefully, she said. But this should be enough to trigger a formal investigation into the HOA's plat history. And that investigation is what actually exposes everything Denise has been hiding for years. I asked what happened to Denise personally if the investigation confirmed everything we suspected. Priya considered the question carefully. Fines against the association. Certainly. Possible removal from the board depending on bylaws. And if intentional fraud gets proven regarding those plat amendments, that moves into criminal territory entirely, she said. Criminal territory. Possibility until she said it aloud. This had started as a dispute over a cabin's legality, and had somehow grown into something that could genuinely end Denise Marsh's standing in the community. Her authority, and potentially her freedom, depending on what investigators found. Denise, meanwhile, seemed to sense the walls closing in, because her behavior grew noticeably more erratic that final week before the hearing. Neighbors reported her going door to door personally, urging people to attend and support the community against my supposed land grab, her usual composure visibly fraying at the edges. I spent that last week before the hearing reviewing every document with Priya one final time, making sure nothing was missing, no detail overlooked. Whatever Denise had planned for the hearing itself, I intended to walk into that room with an airtight case built on facts nobody could argue away. The Friday before the hearing, Denise crossed a line that changed the entire tone of this conflict permanently. I received an anonymous text message, sent from a number I didn't recognize, containing a photo of my elderly mother's house in another state, with the caption, "Some things are easier to walk away from." I sat staring at that message for a long time before calling Priya, my hands genuinely shaking for the first time throughout this entire ordeal. This wasn't property law anymore. This was an implicit threat against my family, and it demanded a response far beyond anything a boundary dispute hearing could address. Priya's tone turned immediately serious. "This goes to the sheriff right now. Tonight. Not the county building department," she said. "Threats against family members are criminal. Full stop. We need this documented and investigated separately from the property case. Starting immediately." I drove to the sheriff's office within the hour. The detective who took my statement traced the number to a prepaid phone, purchased with cash at a gas station in town. The kind of untraceable device someone uses specifically to avoid leaving a direct trail back to themselves. Whoever sent it had planned carefully, but not carefully enough. The gas station's security footage, requested by the detective the following morning, showed a woman purchasing the phone 3 days earlier, face partially obscured by a baseball cap, but the build, the walk, and a distinctive silver bracelet visible on her wrist matched Denise Marsh with uncomfortable precision. I hadn't noticed that bracelet consciously before, but the moment the detective mentioned it, I remembered it instantly. A thin silver chain Denise wore constantly, visible in half the photo Sam had taken of her over the months documenting our dispute. It was a small detail, It was potentially devastating. The detective cautioned that footage alone wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough to escalate the investigation formally, requesting a warrant for phone records tied to the prepaid device's activation. If that device had ever connected to Denise's home Wi-Fi network, even briefly, it would establish a much stronger link. I told Priya about the bracelet that same evening, and she went very quiet before speaking. "If this holds up," she said carefully, "we're not just looking at HOA fraud and boundary disputes anymore. We're looking at someone facing criminal harassment and intimidation charges. This could end her far beyond the community." I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt mostly unsettled, realizing how far Denise had apparently been willing to go over a piece of land that, according to every legitimate document, had never actually belonged to her association in the first place. The stakes had grown far larger than property. Sam, when I told him about the threatening text, went pale in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "That's not the Denise the neighborhood knows," he said quietly. "The pushy HOA president. Sure. But threatening someone's family? That's a different kind of person entirely." I agreed completely. The hearing, now just 3 days away, suddenly felt secondary to the criminal investigation unfolding in parallel. Priya reassured me both processes could move forward independently, and that evidence from one might well strengthen the other, particularly if the county's plat investigation revealed a broader pattern of deliberate misconduct. I barely slept those final nights, mind racing through every possible outcome, every way Denise might still find to escalate further before facing any real consequence. Sam's wife started checking in on me daily, worried, bringing over meals I mostly couldn't finish, my appetite entirely swallowed by anxiety and adrenaline. 2 days before the hearing, the detective called with an update. The prepaid phone had indeed connected briefly to a Wi-Fi network registered under Denise Marsh's home address, a connection logged just hours before the threatening text was sent. It wasn't a slam-dunk conviction, but it was damning circumstantial evidence. That same afternoon, in what felt like the universe delivering one final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, Todd Marsh called Priya's office directly, voice shaking, asking to speak with an attorney about something he needed to get off his chest regarding the survey document he'd produced for his aunt months earlier. Priya met with Todd the following morning, recording the conversation with his full consent. He admitted, plainly and without much prompting, that Denise had asked him to fabricate boundary numbers specifically designed to make my cabin appear to encroach on association land, despite him having no surveying license or credentials whatsoever. He also admitted, almost as an afterthought, that Denise had asked him to buy a prepaid phone for her, just in case she needed to make some calls she didn't want traced back to her own number. He hadn't known what she intended to use it for. He suspected now, though. Todd agreed to provide a full written statement and testify if necessary. Motivated, he said, by guilt he'd been carrying for months and fear of his own legal exposure now that a criminal investigation had entered the picture. Whatever loyalty he'd once felt toward his aunt had clearly reached its limit. Priya called me that evening, unable to fully mask her excitement despite the professional composure she usually maintained. Todd just handed us a signed confession connecting Denise directly to the fabricated survey and, indirectly, to that prepaid phone, she said.
This case just went from strong.
I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months, a knot of anxiety finally beginning to unwind. It wasn't over yet. Not officially. Not until the hearing and the criminal investigation both concluded. But for the first time, I genuinely believed the truth was about to win decisively. The night before the hearing, couldn't sleep at all. Mind replaying every document, every threat, every small cruelty Denise had inflicted since that very first certified letter. I thought about Etta Byrne, forced from her home years earlier by the same tactics, never given the chance to fight back properly. I thought about Harold, quietly uneasy for years under Denise's unilateral control of the board, too intimidated to speak up until someone else finally did first. I thought about Todd, caught between family loyalty and his own conscience, ultimately choosing honesty once the stakes became too serious to ignore any longer. Mostly, though, I thought about my grandfather, who'd bought that land decades before Cedar Ridge Estates ever existed, who'd told me never to let anyone push me off what belonged to me. I finally understood, staring at the ceiling that sleepless night, exactly how much that advice was about to matter. Morning arrived gray and cold, fitting weather for what felt like a long overdue reckoning. Priya met me outside the county building department an hour before the scheduled hearing. Her briefcase heavy with documents, surveys, statements, incident reports, and now Todd's signed confession, ready to be presented in full for the first time. "Are you ready?" she asked, studying my face carefully. I told her honestly that I didn't know if ready was even the right word, but I was determined, and that would have to be enough. She nodded, satisfied. "Determined works fine," she said. "Let's go end this properly." The hearing room was smaller than I expected. A plain municipal space with fluorescent lighting and rows of folding chairs, several already filled with curious neighbors, including Sam near the front and, to my surprise, Harold sitting quietly a few rows back, looking nervous but resolute about being there. Denise arrived just minutes before the scheduled start, dressed sharply, composed on the surface, though I noticed her hands gripping a folder a little too tightly as she took her seat across the aisle. Whatever confidence she projected outwardly, something in her posture suggested she understood exactly how precarious her position had become. The county hearing officer, a measured woman named Ms. Delgado, opened proceedings by outlining the dual purpose of the session, resolving the disputed property boundary between my cabin and Cedar Ridge Estates, and reviewing allegations of irregular HOA governance practices raised through recent county filings and citizen statements. Priya presented first, methodically laying out Grant Okafor's licensed survey findings, cross-referenced against the county's own historical monuments and my grandfather's original 1974 deed. Ms. read the documents carefully, occasionally asking pointed technical questions that Priya answered without hesitation, every figure backed by verifiable county records. Denise's own attorney, a younger man who looked distinctly uncomfortable, attempted to counter with the plain paper document Todd had originally produced, only for Priya to calmly note that its author held no surveying license whatsoever, a fact confirmed by state licensing records included directly in her formal filing packet.
An expression shifted subtly at that revelation, flipping back through pages of the disputed document with renewed scrutiny. "This was submitted to the county as evidence supporting a lien filing," she said slowly.
"I'll need clarification on how an unlicensed document became the basis for an official legal action." Denise's attorney had no good answer. Glancing sideways at his client for guidance, she didn't seem able to provide either. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Ms. Delgado simply moved forward, noting the irregularity for the record and asking Priya to continue with the remainder of her presentation. Priya then introduced Harold's signed statement describing years of unilateral board decisions, including the original plat amendment that had shifted the clubhouse boundary without any formal board vote or property owner notification, decades earlier. Several neighbors in the gallery shifted audibly in their seats, clearly hearing this for the first time.
And asked Harold directly whether he was prepared to affirm his statement under oath if the matter proceeded further. Harold, visibly nervous but steady, confirmed that he was, adding quietly that he'd wanted to speak up for years and simply hadn't found the courage until recently. The room went silent.
Next came Etta Burns' statement, read aloud by Priya since Etta herself, though present in the gallery, had asked not to speak publicly given the emotional weight of revisiting her old ordeal. The description of her experience 6 years earlier mirrored my own situation with unsettling, deliberate precision. I watched several neighbors' faces change as Etta's account unfolded. Recognition, discomfort, and in a few cases, what looked like genuine guilt for having believed Denise's version of events back then without question. Public opinion, I realized, was shifting in real time, right there in that fluorescent-lit municipal room. Denise finally spoke up herself, her composed facade cracking slightly at the edges. These are unrelated incidents being strung together to make me look like some kind of villain, she said, voice tight. I've served this community faithfully for years. This is a coordinated attack against my leadership.
And unmoved by the appeal to service and leadership, simply asked for Denise's direct response to the specific allegation that she'd personally approved the plat amendment without board authorization. Denise hesitated, then claimed the board had informally agreed at the time, though she couldn't produce any minutes confirming it.
Priya then, calmly and without dramatic flourish, introduced her final piece of evidence, Todd Marsh's signed confession, describing the fabricated survey and the prepaid phone purchase, submitted with full legal counsel and cooperation. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees the moment she began reading it aloud. Denise's face went pale, then flushed with something between fury and panic, as Todd's own words, describing his aunt's specific instructions to falsify boundary numbers, filled the small hearing room. Her attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but she barely seemed to register anything he said anymore.
And paused the proceedings briefly at that point, addressing Denise directly. Given the seriousness of what's been presented, including a potential connection to a separate criminal investigation involving threats against Mr. Cole's family, I'd strongly recommend you consult further with your attorney before making any additional statements.
Denise sat frozen for a long moment, the room utterly silent around her, before finally saying, in a voice much smaller than the one she'd used at every neighborhood meeting for years, I need a recess. Ms. Delgado granted it, calling a 15-minute break that felt like it stretched into an hour. During the recess, I stepped outside with Sam and Priya, needing air after the tension of the room. Sam kept shaking his head, repeating quietly, I can't believe it. I can't believe it, while Priya simply looked satisfied, checking her notes to prepare for whatever Denise's attorney tried next. When the hearing resumed, Denise's attorney requested a formal continuance to allow his client additional time to respond fully to the newly introduced evidence, particularly Todd's confession. MS limited continuance but ordered an immediate hold on all HOA collection actions and boundary claims against my property in the meantime. It wasn't the final resolution yet, but it was unmistakably turning point. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, an official authority had looked at the full picture and ruled, at least provisionally, decisively in my favor. I left that hearing room lighter than I had in months. The following days passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind that settles after a major storm before the full damage becomes clear. Denise didn't appear at her usual spots around the neighborhood. Her porch sat empty. Even her car seemed to vanish from the driveway for days at a stretch. Sam reported that the HOA board had scheduled its own emergency session, without Denise present this time, apparently to discuss leadership continuity in light of recent developments. Harold, now considerably more vocal after his hearing testimony, had reportedly called for her immediate suspension pending the investigation's outcome. I learned through Priya that the county's boundary investigation had formally expanded, now examining not just the clubhouse encroachment but every plat amendment Denise had approved during her tenure as president, along with every recorded complaint filed against neighboring homeowners over the preceding several years. That expanded scope meant Etta Burns' case, and potentially others neither of us knew about yet, might finally receive the scrutiny they'd always deserved. Priya mentioned that county investigators had already reached out to several former Cedar Ridge residents who'd sold and moved away under circumstances eerily similar to my own. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation into the threatening text message progressed steadily. The detective informed me that phone records had confirmed the prepaid device activated near Denise's home Wi-Fi network multiple times, and that Todd's statement corroborated the purchase, giving prosecutors a solid foundation for potential charges. I felt a complicated mixture of relief and unease absorbing all this. Relief, because the truth was finally surfacing in ways that mattered legally. Unease, because I kept thinking about how close this had come to actually harming my mother, simply because one woman couldn't tolerate losing a manufactured argument. Priya reminded me gently that feeling unsettled made complete sense given everything I'd endured. "You're allowed to feel shaken even while winning," she said. "This wasn't a normal dispute. Recognizing that doesn't diminish how well you've handled it." I appreciated her saying so more than I let on. Denise's attorney requested, and received, one additional short extension before the reconvened hearing, apparently attempting to negotiate some kind of settlement behind the scenes with county officials to limit the fallout. Priya warned me this was common in cases where the evidence had become overwhelmingly, undeniably clear. "She's trying to control the landing now that she can't control the story," Priya explained. "Expect an attempt to resign quietly, pay a reduced fine, and avoid the more serious findings becoming permanent public record." I asked whether that outcome would actually satisfy me. Honestly, I wasn't sure it would. I drove out to see Etta again that week, wanting her perspective on whether a quiet resignation and reduced fine would feel like justice after everything Denise had put her through years earlier. Etta considered the question for a long moment before answering with a directness that settled something in me. "I don't need her to suffer forever," Etta said. "I need everyone to finally know the truth. and I need her nowhere near power over anyone else's home ever again. That, more than punishment for its own sake, felt like the outcome genuinely worth fighting for through this entire ordeal. I relayed that sentiment to Priya, who agreed it aligned well with what the evidence could realistically achieve. Removal from any HOA leadership position, public correction of the record, restitution for what she's cost you and others, and let the criminal investigation handle whatever consequences the threat deserves separately, she summarized. That plan felt right to me, measured rather than vengeful, focused on preventing future harm rather than simply punishing past wrongs. Still, some small part of me couldn't help hoping the reconvened hearing would expose everything fully and publicly, leaving no ambiguity whatsoever about what Denise Marsh had actually done. Sam mentioned that community sentiment had shifted dramatically in the weeks since the first hearing session, with several neighbors who'd once signed Denise's petition now approaching him privately, embarrassed, asking whether they should retract their signatures or issue some kind of apology to me directly. I told him it wasn't necessary. People believed a confident liar over a quiet truth, I told Sam. That's not unique to this neighborhood. I'd rather they just remember it next time someone tries the same thing. Sam nodded slowly, seeming to turn that idea over carefully in his mind before agreeing it made sense. The reconvened hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Priya spent the preceding days finalizing every remaining detail, additional witness statements from 2 other former Cedar Ridge residents who'd come forward after hearing about the investigation, describing complaints eerily similar to what Etta and I had both experienced. One of them, a man named Reyes who'd sold his lot 3 years earlier, provided documentation showing Denise had personally pressured the county assessor's office to reclassify part of his property as association common ground, using language nearly identical to what she'd used against me. The pattern was undeniable now. Priya organized all of it into a single comprehensive filing for MS Delgado's review, alongside updated confirmation from Grant Okafor that the Clubhouse encroachment finding remained unchanged, and formal notice from the detective's office that charges against Denise for the threatening communication were now actively being prepared. I read through the entire filing the night before the hearing, struck by how much had accumulated in just a few short months. A story that started with a single false accusation against my cabin had grown into a documented, multi-victim pattern of abuse of power spanning years of unchecked authority. Priya called that evening with one final update. Denise's attorney had formally requested to withdraw from representing her, citing irreconcilable differences regarding how to proceed, a move that typically signaled a client either refusing reasonable advice or facing legal exposure severe enough to make continued representation professionally risky. That's not a good sign for her, Priya said, though her tone carried no real satisfaction, just professional assessment. When your own attorney walks away days before a major hearing, it usually means they've concluded the situation is genuinely as bad as the evidence suggests, or worse than even we know. I spent that final night before the reconvened hearing thinking less about Denise herself and more about everyone she'd affected along the way. Etta, forced from her home years earlier. Harold, intimidated into silence for far too long. Todd, caught in the wreckage of his own aunt's choices. I thought, too, about my grandfather, who could never have imagined the neighborhood that eventually grew up around his old pastureland, or the fight his old deed would one day help win, decades after he'd passed, simply by having been recorded honestly and accurately all those years ago. Morning came, and I drove to the county building for the second time in weeks, feeling different than before, less anxious, more resolved, ready to see this through to whatever conclusion the evidence ultimately demanded. Priya met me outside again, calm and prepared, her briefcase somehow even fuller than last time. "Whatever happens in there today," she said, "you've already won the part that matters most. Your cabin is legally yours." That was never actually in question once Grant's survey came back. Everything else now is just about making sure the full truth gets recorded properly. I nodded, grateful for the reminder. The hearing room was fuller this time, word having clearly spread through the community about what had unfolded in the previous session. Etta sat near the front again, alongside Reyes, the former resident who'd recently come forward. Harold arrived early, sitting close to Priya's table like he wanted to be visibly aligned with the truth this time. Denise arrived without her previous attorney, accompanied instead by a new lawyer who looked visibly unfamiliar with the case's extensive documentation, clearly having been retained only days earlier. She looked smaller somehow, the confident posture from the first hearing entirely absent, replaced by something closer to quiet dread.
In the session by summarizing the expanded scope of the investigation, noting the additional witness statements, Grant's unchanged survey findings, and formal confirmation from the county attorney's office that the original plat amendment shifting the clubhouse boundary had never received proper board authorization or homeowner notification.
She then turned to Denise's new attorney, asking directly whether his client intended to contest any of the survey findings, the licensing status of the previously submitted document, or Todd Marsh's signed confession. He requested a brief moment to confer with his client before responding to any of it. The whispered conversation between Denise and her new attorney stretched on for nearly 2 full minutes, the room watching in uncomfortable silence, before he finally stood and said, quietly, that his client did not intend to contest the factual findings regarding the property boundary or the fabricated survey document. A murmur rippled through the gallery at that admission, the first real acknowledgement from Denise's side that everything Priya had presented was, in fact, true. MS. Unsurprised, and asked whether Denise wished to address the hearing directly regarding the board governance allegations and the harassment pattern described. Denise stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table, and for a long moment said nothing at all, staring somewhere past the gallery toward the back wall. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the commanding certainty I'd grown used to over the previous months. Sounded, instead, almost hollow. "I built this community," she said. "Every rule, every standard, I enforced it because someone had to. Maybe I made mistakes with boundaries. But everything I did to protect what we built here." MS. And without visible reaction, letting the statement finish completely before responding.
MS. She said evenly, "The evidence presented shows a pattern spanning years, a fabricated survey, an unauthorized boundary shift benefiting association property, harassment of multiple homeowners, and a credible connection to a criminal threat currently under separate investigation. This isn't a story about protecting a community.
The room went utterly silent as MS. Delgado continued, person consolidating unchecked authority and using it to intimidate anyone who threatened that control. Denise's face crumpled slightly at those words, the first genuine crack in her composure since the entire ordeal had begun months earlier. Priya leaned over and whispered that this moment, more than anything else in the entire proceeding, represented the county formally rejecting Denise's narrative in favor of the documented truth. I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph exactly, but a deep, quiet relief that the record would finally reflect reality.
Moved to formal findings, ruling definitively that my cabin's property boundary matched Grant Okafor's license survey and my grandfather's original 1974 deed, with no HOA jurisdiction whatsoever over my parcel. Every lien, every complaint, every claim Denise had filed against me was formally voided, effective immediately.
She further ruled that the clubhouse's rear deck did, in fact, encroach onto my property by approximately 42 feet, ordering the HOA to either remove the encroaching structure within 90 days or formally negotiate an easement agreement with me directly at the association's expense, not mine. A quiet gasp moved through the gallery at that ruling, several neighbors glancing toward each other in visible disbelief. The very clubhouse where Denise had hosted countless board meetings and neighborhood gatherings, the symbol of her authority over Cedar Ridge Estates, now stood formally, legally, on land that wasn't the association's at all.
Continued, addressing the governance allegations directly. She ordered a formal county audit of every plat amendment Denise had approved during her presidency, citing sufficient evidence of irregular, unauthorized boundary changes affecting multiple homeowners, including Etta Burns' former parcel and at least 2 others recently identified.
The audit, Ms. Delgado explained, would determine whether restitution was owed to previously affected homeowners, potentially reopening property assessments that had never been properly verified in the first place. Etta, sitting quietly in the gallery, pressed a hand to her mouth, visibly overwhelmed by finally hearing those words spoken officially. Regarding the fabricated survey document, Ms. Delgado referred the matter directly to the state licensing board and county prosecutor's office, noting that submitting an unlicensed, fraudulent survey to support an official lien filing constituted a serious violation warranting further legal review beyond her own administrative authority to resolve. She then addressed Denise personally, her tone firm but not unkind. Given the severity and pattern of these findings, I'm recommending your immediate removal as HOA president, pending the board's own bylaws process, and referring this matter for review regarding potential civil liability toward the homeowners you've affected. Denise said nothing in response, simply nodding once, her earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by something that looked almost like exhaustion. Her new attorney whispered something to her, and she sat back down heavily, staring at the table in front of her without meeting anyone else's eyes in the room.
Closed the formal boundary and governance portion of the hearing there, noting that the separate criminal investigation into the threatening communication toward my family would proceed independently through the sheriff's office and county prosecutor, with findings from today's hearing available to support that process as needed.
As the hearing adjourned, the room erupted into a low buzz of conversation, neighbors turning to each other in visible shock at how thoroughly the narrative had reversed itself. Sam gripped my shoulder firmly, grinning for the first time in what felt like months. "It's really over," he said.
You act.
I wasn't entirely sure, one, was the right word for how any of this felt, given everything it had cost. Months of anxiety, a threatened family, a slashed set of tires, sleepless nights stretching back further than I could easily count. But something had undeniably finally been set right. Etta approached me outside the hearing room, eyes wet, and simply took my hand without saying anything for a long moment. "Thank you," she finally said, "for not giving up when it would have been so much easier to just walk away. Like I did." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Harold approached next, looking lighter than I'd seen him throughout this entire process, thanking me quietly for giving him the opening to finally speak up about years of governance concerns he'd carried silently. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted.
"I'm glad someone finally..."
Reyes, the former resident who'd come forward with his own story, mentioned he intended to formally request the county audit examine whether he was owed restitution for the reclassified portion of his old property, information that might finally explain financial losses he'd never fully understood at the time of his sale. Priya, packing up her briefcase amid the dispersing crowd, looked more satisfied than I'd seen her throughout the entire case. "This is about as complete a vindication as these things ever get," she said. "Boundary confirmed in your favor, encroachment ruling against the HOA, fraud referral, governance audit, and a criminal investigation running parallel." I asked her what came next practically, now that the hearing itself had concluded with such a decisive outcome. She explained the HOA would have 90 days to address the clubhouse encroachment. The state licensing board would investigate Todd's fraudulent document independently, and the county audit would likely take several months. As for the criminal investigation, she said the detective's office would continue building its case regarding the threatening text message, now considerably strengthened by today's hearing establishing Denise's documented pattern of intimidation and unauthorized action stretching back years across multiple homeowners and property disputes. Driving home that afternoon, I passed the Cedar Ridge Estates entrance sign, the same one I'd driven past 100 times, feeling dread building in my chest with each visit for months. This time, for the first time in what felt like forever, I simply felt tired in the good way, relieved, unburdened. Sam had organized, without telling me beforehand, a small informal gathering at his place that evening, a handful of neighbors who wanted to mark the occasion properly. It wasn't a celebration exactly, given everything that had happened, but it felt like something the community genuinely needed after months of quiet tension. Several neighbors who'd signed Denise's original petition attended too, several offering quiet, somewhat awkward apologies for having believed her narrative so readily months earlier. I accepted each one graciously, understanding that fear and confident lies could move a community faster than careful truth ever managed to on its own. Etta stayed late that evening, talking with several longtime residents about her own experience for what she said was the first time she'd ever felt comfortable discussing it openly in this neighborhood. Several people apologized to her directly too, admitting they'd never questioned Denise's version of events back then either. I found myself, watching all this unfold, thinking less about vindication and more about how easily unchecked authority could quietly reshape an entire community's sense of what was normal, until someone finally refused to simply accept it and go along quietly like everyone before them apparently had. 2 weeks later, news arrived that the state licensing board had formally confirmed Todd Marsh held no surveying credentials whatsoever, and had referred the matter to the county prosecutor alongside the existing fraud allegations tied to the original fabricated boundary document he'd produced for his aunt's use against me. Todd, through his own attorney, ultimately agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges related to his role, citing his signed confession and ongoing testimony as evidence of genuine remorse rather than continued participation in whatever scheme Denise had originally orchestrated around the fabricated survey. The county audit into Denise's plat amendments, meanwhile, expanded further than even Priya had initially anticipated, ultimately identifying 4 separate homeowners, including Etta and Reyes, whose property boundaries had been quietly, improperly altered during Denise's tenure as HOA president without proper authorization or resident notification at any point. Each of those 4 cases triggered its own restitution review, county officials working methodically through years of accumulated paperwork to determine what, if anything, each affected homeowner was still owed given the improper boundary changes made entirely at Denise's personal direction over the preceding decade of her leadership. Harold, appointed interim HOA president following Denise's formal removal by the board, reached out to me personally to apologize on behalf of the association and to begin, in good faith, negotiating the required easement agreement regarding the clubhouse's encroaching rear deck, exactly as Ms. Delgado's ruling had ordered. We settled the matter amicably within a month, Harold's board agreeing to either relocate the deck's foundation or formally purchase a permanent easement from me at fair market value, whichever proved more practical once contractors assessed the actual cost of moving a structure that size safely. Ultimately, the board chose the easement route, and I received fair compensation for the portion of my land the clubhouse had unknowingly, or rather knowingly given everything we'd uncovered, occupied for years. It felt like a strange kind of closure, being paid for land that had always technically belonged to me anyway. The criminal case against Denise moved more slowly, as these things often do, but eventually resulted in formal charges related to the threatening communication toward my family, supported by the prepaid phone records, the gas station footage, and Todd's corroborating testimony regarding her request for an untraceable device. I learned, through updates from the detective handling the case, that Denise ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, resulting in probation, a formal restraining order preventing any contact with me or my family, and a permanent record reflecting exactly what she'd done, regardless of how she framed it publicly. Word of the entire situation eventually spread beyond Cedar Ridge Estates itself. A local news outlet picking up the story after Etta, encouraged by everything that had unfolded, agreed to share her own experience publicly for the first time, hoping it might help other homeowners recognize similar patterns elsewhere. The resulting news coverage highlighted not just my case but the broader pattern uncovered through the county audit, prompting several other HOA associations in neighboring counties to review their own governance practices proactively, apparently unwilling to risk facing a similar public reckoning down the road themselves. I gave a brief interview myself, careful to focus on the facts rather than dramatize anything unnecessarily, emphasizing mainly how important it had been to document everything methodically from the very beginning, rather than simply trusting that reasonable people would recognize an obviously false accusation on its own. Priya, watching the coverage unfold with clear professional satisfaction, told me the case had become something of a reference point among local attorneys handling HOA disputes, an unusually thorough example of how a single false accusation, properly documented and challenged, could ultimately expose years of unchecked institutional abuse. I thought, reading through the news coverage myself one quiet evening, about how differently everything might have ended if I'd simply given up early on, sold the cabin at a loss like Denise clearly expected, and let the whole matter quietly disappear the way it apparently had for so many others before me. Instead, my grandfather's old deed, carefully preserved decades before anyone imagined Cedar Ridge Estates would even exist, had ultimately outlasted every fabricated document, every false claim, every intimidation tactic Denise Marsh had deployed against me and against others across years of unquestioned authority over an entire neighborhood. Denise put her house up for sale within 2 months of the plea agreement, apparently unwilling, or perhaps simply unable, to continue living among neighbors who now knew the full truth about everything she'd done, not just to me, but to Etta, to Reyes, and to at least 2 other quiet, uncredited victims. Sam mentioned that her house sat on the market longer than most in the neighborhood, prospective buyers apparently doing their own research once local news coverage made her name easily searchable online, connecting any curious search directly to fraud, harassment, and a criminal threat investigation spanning several months. 266. The new HOA board, led by Harold, implemented formal governance reforms within weeks, requiring full board votes with documented minutes for any boundary or assessment decisions, mandatory license surveys for any disputed property claims, and an independent review process for complaints filed against individual homeowners going forward. Etta attended the board's first public meeting under the new structure, sitting quietly near the back, watching procedures unfold with actual transparency for what she said was the first time in the many years she'd lived near, or once within, Cedar Ridge Estates before Denise had forced her out. Reyes, meanwhile, received a modest restitution payment following the county's audit findings regarding his old property's improperly reclassified boundary, along with a formal written acknowledgement from the association admitting the error had originated from unauthorized decisions made entirely outside proper HOA governance procedures at the time. I finished the remaining repairs on my cabin that autumn. The same porch railing and garden fence I'd started so long ago now finally completed without the constant undercurrent of dread that had shadowed every weekend since Denise's first certified letter arrived months earlier demanding my cabin's immediate removal. Sam and his wife came over for dinner one crisp October evening. The 3 of us sitting on that finished porch watching the sun drop behind the ridge line, talking about ordinary things again, whether work, small neighborhood gossip that had nothing whatsoever to do with lawsuits or fabricated surveys. Feels different up here now, Sam said, watching the light fade over the trees. Quieter, somehow, even though nothing about the land itself actually changed. I understood exactly what he meant. The land had always been mine. What had changed was simply everyone finally acknowledging that plain, recorded truth. I called Etta occasionally through that autumn, checking in, and she told me once that she'd finally started sleeping properly again. Something she said she hadn't managed consistently since the year Denise had pushed her out of her old home. Justice took a long time, she said. But it came. Harold reached out one more time before winter, inviting me to an informal community gathering the new board was organizing. A genuine olive branch after months of institutional dysfunction under Denise's leadership. I attended, cautiously at first, surprised by how warmly several neighbors greeted me despite our rocky history. Todd, I learned later through Priya, ultimately received a reduced sentence given his cooperation, along with a permanent bar from ever performing land surveying work of any kind, a formality given he'd never actually held a license, but a clear public marker nonetheless of exactly what he'd done. The clubhouse deck itself was eventually relocated the following spring, the HOA covering the full cost after negotiating the final easement details with my attorney, ensuring the structure sat entirely, unambiguously within the association's own legally verified boundary for the first time since its original unauthorized construction years earlier. I watched the construction crew dismantle and rebuild that deck from my own porch one Saturday morning, feeling something settle permanently in my chest. As the last board came down from what had, technically, sat on my family's land for longer than most of the neighborhood realized was even possible. Priya closed our case file formally that winter, calling one last time to confirm every element had been resolved, the boundary confirmed, the encroachment corrected, restitution processed, Denise's criminal case concluded, and the licensing fraud against Todd fully adjudicated through the appropriate state channels months after the initial hearing. "You handled this about as well as anyone could have," she told me. "Most people would have given up somewhere around the fabricated lien, or definitely after the fence went up overnight. You didn't, and it mattered, not just for you, but for everyone else Denise had quietly harmed before you." I thought about that assessment for a long while after we hung up, recognizing how much simple persistence, careful documentation, and a willingness to trust the slow, unglamorous process of gathering real evidence had ultimately mattered more than any single dramatic confrontation ever could have on its own. Etta invited me to her daughter's house for Thanksgiving that year, an invitation I accepted gladly, grateful for the strange, unexpected friendship that had grown out of an ordeal neither of us would have chosen, but that had ultimately connected two strangers who'd survived the same quiet, institutional cruelty. We didn't talk much about Denise that evening, mostly just sharing an ordinary holiday meal, ordinary conversation, the kind of peace neither of us had really felt possible during the months our respective ordeals had unfolded. Felt, more than anything else, like something had genuinely finally closed. Winter settled over the ridge properly that December, snow dusting the pines around my cabin, the same land my grandfather had walked decades earlier, long before HOA boundaries or fabricated surveys or any of the chaos that had briefly threatened to take it away from me entirely. I stood on the porch one particularly quiet evening, watching snow fall over the tree line, thinking about how close this had all come to ending very differently, how easily, without Priya's careful methodical approach, without Grant's license survey, without Todd's late confession, the truth might have simply stayed buried forever. Sam stopped by that same week, bringing firewood he insisted I didn't need but appreciated anyway, and we sat by the stove talking about nothing important for hours, the kind of easy, unremarkable evening that had felt entirely impossible just months earlier when every knock at my door carried dread. The new HOA board sent a formal letter that winter too, unprompted, officially closing the file on my case with a written acknowledgement that my cabin had never violated any code, any boundary, or any legitimate association rule at any point throughout the entire, exhausting ordeal that had consumed most of my year. I framed my grandfather's original 1974 deed that same week, hanging it prominently near the cabin's front door, a small, quiet monument to the simple fact that had ultimately outlasted every fabricated document, every false accusation, every intimidation tactic thrown against it over these long, difficult months of struggle. Reyes called occasionally too, mentioning he'd started attending the new transparent board meetings himself, curious about a community he'd once fled entirely under. Circumstances eerily similar to my own, now apparently rebuilding itself into something considerably more honest than it had ever been under Denise's unchecked leadership. By the time spring arrived again, Cedar Ridge Estates looked, from the outside at least, much like any other quiet mountain neighborhood. Mailboxes painted the approved colors, lawns trimmed to code, nothing outwardly suggesting the reckoning that had unfolded there just months earlier, reshaping its entire governance from the inside out. But those of us who'd lived through it knew better, understood exactly how fragile ordinary peace could be when left unchecked in the hands of someone willing to fabricate documents, threaten families, and intimidate an entire community into silence, simply to protect authority she'd never actually possessed legitimately in the first place. The county's final restitution payments to Etta, Reyes, and the two other previously unidentified homeowners went out that spring. Modest sums given how many years had passed, but meaningful nonetheless as formal, undeniable acknowledgement that real harm had occurred under Denise's leadership, harm the county now officially recognized in writing. Denise's house sold that same spring to a family from out of state who, according to Sam, knew nothing whatsoever about the neighborhood's recent history, simply drawn by the mountain views and reasonable price, entirely unaware of the reckoning that had unfolded on that exact street just months before their arrival. I finished planting my garden that April, the same bed I'd started the very week Denise first walked my property line with an unauthorized tape measure, feeling a strange, satisfying symmetry in returning to that simple task now that the entire ordeal had finally, completely run its course. Priya sent one last email that spring, mostly just checking in, mentioning she still occasionally referenced our case when training newer associates at her firm, calling it a clear example of what patient, methodical documentation could accomplish even against someone determined to weaponize an entire community's trust against a single homeowner. Harold's board continued its transparent governance practices through that first full year, and by all accounts the neighborhood functioned noticeably better than it had under Denise's unilateral control, with disputes now resolved through actual license surveys and full board votes rather than one person's unquestioned personal authority. I sat on my finished porch one warm May evening, a full year almost exactly since that first certified letter had arrived accusing my cabin of illegal construction, watching the sunset over land that had always, undeniably, legally belonged to my family since long before any of this began. My grandfather had told me once never to let anyone push me off what was mine, and I finally understood, sitting there in the quiet, exactly why that advice had mattered so much. The land itself had never actually been in question. What mattered was refusing to let a lie stand unchallenged. Denise Marsh, once the undisputed authority over an entire mountain neighborhood, ultimately lost her position, her reputation, and her home, all because she couldn't accept that a single quiet cabin owner would rather fight with facts than fold under pressure. Exactly the way she'd always counted on people doing before. Etta, Reyes, Harold, Todd's reluctant honesty, Grant's careful survey, Priya's methodical patience. Every piece had mattered, together proving that even the most confidently Wielded lie eventually collapses under the simple, stubborn weight of documented, verifiable truth, however long it takes to finally bring that truth into the light. My cabin still stands exactly where my grandfather always said it would, on land that was always, legally, entirely mine, long after the woman who tried to take it from me packed up and left the mountain for good.